Okay, in this lecture, I'm going to cover forms. So I'm going to talk about forms and buttons and a little bit about form validation. So forms and buttons. So we're using forms to gather information from the users. And typically, at least in sort of more traditional websites, the information in forms is being sent to the server. The server will do some processing on the form and send back some kind of response to the user. So the sort of standard model of forms is we're doing some stuff in the browser, click submit on the form, the browser packages up the data, sends it to the web server, we're running PHP or JavaScript or whatever on the server, and then do some stuff to the form, save some things in the database, and then it'll send a new page that will be displayed to the user. So classic example, the user does a search, for example, in Google, enters something into the search bar in Google, that search request is sent off to the web server, so it looks in the database for an appropriate set of pages, and then sends it back to the user. Or maybe the user registers on the website, they click submit, the web server then creates an entry in the database for the user, and then sends back a reply saying registration successful or something like that. So let's have a little look at an example of a form. So it's a standard HTML element with a few specific attributes that you need to include under some circumstances. So down here is the usual thing. We have type in your name, click submit, whatever. We have the sort of labels on the form, which are just standard sort of bits of text. And then we've got the actual form components, which are these HTML input fields, these things here. So this is the sort of HTML form element, and it's got this attribute action. And action means which page on which server script do I want to handle this form when the user clicks submit. So in this case, it's going to be like process form script, PHP script on the server. So when I click on submit, the form is going to be sent, the data in the form is going to be sent to this location here. Now method I'm going to come to in a little bit. And forms typically contain input elements. So we have and these input elements come in different types, and you set the type, and the type is an attribute of the input element. So one type is text. In this case, this is going to get text input from the user, for both cases in this example. Then we have name. Name is absolutely crucial to understand, because on the server, it's going to use name to access the data in the form. So if it wants to access the first name, or what the data entered here, the server will use name to access the data that the user types in there, and it'll use last name as the key to access the data that the user enters there. And value, as I come to, is you can set a default value for these input fields, and value is also accessed when you're using the JavaScript. If you want to pull out the data from this form, this input field, then you need to use the value property. Then we have input type submit. That's this button here. And when you click on, if it's an input type submit, when you click on it, it'll send off the form to that script. So the input field is the sort of the working, one of the crucial parts of the form, because otherwise you're not getting any data from the user. And the type and the settings of this type attribute here will determine the type of input field that it is. So we've got things like text, password, radio, checkbox, and submit. And I'll just run through some of these. So text inputs, one of the more standard ones. And it has a name attribute, which is used to identify the HTML elements, as explained. And the value attribute is you can use to set the default text. So text input is just this bit here, where the user can type some stuff. And then we specify that it's type text, and name, we just give it, that's what the server uses to access its name, access the input field. And we can also give it a value if we wanted to set Buckaroo Banzai as the default text, or something else, right? Then we've got password input. Functions pretty much the same as a text input, except you just get these dots for these password masking feature, so that if someone's looking over your shoulders, you log into your bank, then they can't see what your password is unless they look carefully at your typing. A submit button. This causes the form to be submitted. So usually, fairly straightforward. Radio inputs. So radio inputs, you typically got a number of different options, like hot, not, whatever, this slightly bizarre example. And so we're using the type radio. The crucial thing is, to make it a radio input, we have to give them if we want, the user can select one of these, and we give them all the same name. So that from the server's point of view, it just sees name, hot or not, which will have a particular value hot or not, depending on which of the radio buttons are selected. So all of the radios that are part of a single grouping must have a single name. And checkbox is similar. They almost have the same name. The type is checkbox. And again, we can give it salt, pepper, garlic. And I imagine these are kind of concatenated on the server side, but I haven't actually tried it. Text area is useful if you want to have lots of text from the user on multiple lines. So here we have, again, we're giving it a name. But here we can specify the rows and cols attributes to specify the width and the height of the text area. And select, this is for selecting a specific option. So here we have a select. It's not an input in this case. It's a select input field, input type or something like that. We use the select HTML element anyway. And then we have, within the select, we have a bunch of options. And we have a value of the options, but also the text that the user sees. So the value is what the server sees. The text is what the user sees. So if the user selects Buckaroo Banzai, the server will see characters with a value of Buckaroo in that case. And there's a bunch of HTML5 input types, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but these are very well worth using in your websites for reasons I'll explain. But just the short version is this will save you an awful lot of hassle in terms of input validation. So for example, if you use date input field, well, firstly, it's easier for the user to select a date. But secondly, it avoids all the confusion of the American date system, which is like month, day, year, versus the British system, which is year, day, month, year, right? If you use this, the user will pick a date, and you'll know exactly what format that date's going to be when it's processed in the server. And similarly, for these other inputs, by constraining what the user puts into the fields, you can make it much easier to process the data from the user. So color input, again, you know exactly what you're going to get from the user. Range input, you're going to get, or number input, again, you're going to get a number. If the user accidentally puts a bit of text in, it won't be, they can't type any text into a number input field. So again, it's restricting the user, which is making it easier for you to validate the data from the user. So I recommend you take a look at these. Now, your JavaScript code is going to need to be able to access the data in a form. For form validation, JavaScript often used for server-side, for client-side form validation, which I'm going to cover later, but also for client-side form processing. So in Coursework 1, we're not using a server except to do some basic PHP scripts. Most of the hard work in Coursework 1 is going to be done by the JavaScript. So it's going to be the JavaScript that's going to be processing the forms in Coursework 1. So to access the forms in JavaScript, it's very easy. We can just use these standard document object model methods that we talked about in the previous lecture. And the data in each of the input fields is inside the value property of the input element. So I'm going to give you some examples of that. So suppose at the bottom, so it's a little bit small, we've got a page. So here here's the HTML, right? We've got like a header, and then we've got a form. We've got an event. Oh yes, we've got in this case, an event handler on submit, which calls this submit form method, which is probably not the best way of doing it, but never mind. And we've given the form a name, my form, given it ID, test form. So when the user enters a name and they click submit, it's going to call this the onSubmit method, which is going to tell us what the text is in it. So in this case, the thing I really want to highlight here is that to access this input field, I'm getting the test form, that's this form here, and I'm accessing the my name field in that form, which is here, and I'm accessing the value, and the value is whatever the user's typed in here. You must use value, or the whole thing just isn't going to work. So yeah, we're getting the element test form, and then we're getting my name, which is this input field here, has a name called my name, dot value. So that's one way in which you can use to access using the ID of a form. Another way you could do it is the document has a forms property, which is like an array of all the forms, or actually maybe an object, containing all the forms in the document. So all the forms in the page will be available by going document.forms. Now this form has a name, my form, so I can do document.forms my form, which will get me to this piece of HTML. Then inside the form, there's an input element called my name, so that gets me to the next bit here. And then value will let me get out the value of the data inside that the user's typed in down there. Now, there's two different ways in which forms send data to the server. So this will probably be more useful next term than this term. but I'm going to put it in here anyway. So we have post and we have get. So what post does is it packages up all the data in the form. So all of this stuff inside all the data in the input fields, it packages it up and puts it in the body of the HTTP message that's being sent to the server. So, so you have the URL stays the same, it just sends the data off in a way that's invisible to the user and sort of hidden from the user. On the other hand, so post is generally used when you're doing things like registration, actions that are only done once, and actions that aren't going to be bookmarked in any way, like paying for your shopping or something like that. Whereas get is different. Get's like, you're still using a form with get, but in this case, the form variable is appended to the end of the URL. So if you're doing a search for something, you can bookmark that search and just go to the same URL with all the form variables at the end, and it'll retrieve the same page. So post and get is an important distinction, and we specify that at the end of using method attribute and setting it to post or setting it to get. So with post, yeah, you have a single sort of, the URL stays the same, but everything inside the form is sent in the body of the HTTP message to the server. Whereas with get, everything's bunged on the end. So we have like first name Buckaroo, last name Banzai. So with get, it's appended to the end of the URL, so I could kind of bookmark this link, and it'll take me, and the server will respond with the same page or the same data each time. I can call that and send that link to my friends or whatever. With post, bookmarking this won't do anything because the data has to be packed inside the body of the message of the HTTP message that's being sent there. In this term, we're only focusing on forms processing on client side using JavaScript. And to be frank, this term, using forms, the form HTML element is a bit of a pain, bit of a hassle, and so we're not going to worry too much about that. It's much easier, as I'm going to show you, using input elements and HTML buttons to process data with JavaScript without a form. So for this term, I suggest this approach. Next term, you're probably going to be focus more on this kind of approach. So to make this all work in JavaScript, instead of having the submit button, which will try and send everything off to a server and reload the page and all this kind of thing, what we can do instead is we can just use a simple click button, a simple button, and it handles some events on that button so that when the user clicks on that, we can pull out the data from the form and do what we want to do with it in JavaScript. And buttons have all kinds of stuff like autofocus, a bunch of different events. We don't have to worry too much about that. And so this is an example of form-free input from the user. So you can adapt this example for your registration and login functionality, for example. So here we've got header, login, and here we have a paragraph. I think I'm highlighting it up. So we've got inside the paragraph, we can use the input elements outside of a form. We can just use them by themselves. So here we have the input element type text, and we're giving it an ID, in this case using IDs, giving it an ID my name, and password, input type password, and we're giving it an ID password. So using everything we covered in the previous lectures, we can use document get element by ID my name. That gives us a reference to this input element. Now we need to do .value to pull out whatever the user's typed into here. And then we've just going to easily, and that's how we can just access whatever the user's typed here. And the same here, we're doing document get element by ID my password. We'll pull out this HTML element, and then we can get the value of that, the value that the user's typed in by doing .value, by accessing the value property. Now the password's it's not encrypted or anything, it's just obscured so the user can't see it. So within your JavaScript, that password would just be plain text. Right, so I think it's time for a demo, a lot of theory. So let's go to here. Righty-ho, so let's create a form first. So we'll stick in a paragraph, why not? Eh? So we've got a paragraph here. Inside the paragraph, we're going to have name, let's say. This is just text. And then we're going to input type equals text. I think we'll just forget about the password. Type equals text. It doesn't really need a name, but we'll give it a name anyway. Well, maybe we'll get rid of that name. Give an ID for sure. ID be my text, let's say. And is that all we need? Oh yeah, we'll give it a value. Give it default value. Hello. Okay, so let's just have a look at that, make sure that's worked. Guaranteed in this life. Excuse me, let me just find this thing. Sorry about this. All right. Right, yeah, there we go. So we got it. So we've got name, hello, name's just a bit of text we gave, so the user knows what it is, and here's the default text there, okay? So that's worked fine. Let's go back to our thing. So now we can write the JavaScript that accesses that form, which is very easy. So var my input equals document get element by ID. Now, would I give it my text, right? And now if we want to output that, we can just do let's do an alert, make it easier. Alert my input. Now we have to do dot value to get the value that the user's typed in. And then with a bit of luck, that'll work. So let's refresh it. So it's saying hello, fantastic. My name is Brian, for example. Right, so it's always going to say hello because I haven't added a button, right? So let's add the button. So now let's add a button. Just got to remember how to add a button. Button. Okay, button's pretty easy, but look at it. All right, let's add a button. So we've got the name, and then we've got the button ID. So I'm going to attach the events later, and we'll button click me or something, yeah. So we're not doing so. Yeah. So now we've got the button, click me. Fantastic. So now what we're going to do is do var my button do this more elegantly, but this is just a demo, right? My button. So now my button on click equals show text. Okay, so we've added an event handler, so when we click on the button, it will call my show text function. And that's exactly what this does. Function show text. Right. Let's try this. So refresh it. Oh, we didn't save it. We did save it. So it's going off a little funny here. Console's fine. Should always test your demos before you record lectures on them. Right, let's just see what's going wrong here. All right, let's do it the exact way I did it, because I'm not quite sure I'm going wrong. Click equals okay. Let's get rid of that. Right. So I'm not quite sure I was triggering the button immediately, but let's not worry about that. So hello, Brian here. Okay, so I'm sure it can be fixed. Right, that's why. So, we're kind of calling the function already instead of pointing it to the function. That, I think, is probably the problem. Yep, there we go. So click me says hello, and blah, 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 blah. Click me says hello. Okay. So, in some ways it's good. These kind of silly mistakes because you're going to hit these silly mistakes too, right? So my silly mistake was I put the smooth braces around here, so that tells JavaScript to execute that and then return the result of executing that function, which is not what we wanted. What we wanted to do is point that to the function so that it was executed when you clicked on the button. So it works now anyway. So now we've got a button. You click on the button, it will alert the contents of the text bar. Great. It's all about deliberate mistakes, right? Right, so to give you a little bit of assistance with your coursework 1, in case you need it, in case you're thinking of writing the kind of lame, simple quiz that I gave as an example of a project in the lecture on coursework 1, I'm going to show you how you can use everything I've told you in this lecture so far to write a simple quiz program. So what this does is it's got a question. We type in the answer to the question, click submit. If we get the answer right, it'll say answer correct. If we get the answer wrong, it'll say answer incorrect. So I'll give you a little demo, and then we'll go through how it actually works. So here's the simple quiz. So it asks this question, who's the last king of France? And if we say John, for example, and submit the answer, it tells us the answer is incorrect. And if we type Louis XV1, the chap who got his head chopped off, click submit answer, and it says answer correct. So not revolutionary, but it's a simple quiz. So components of this are the question here, the paragraph. So obviously, if this was a proper quiz, we'd have some kind of array of questions. We'd give this paragraph an ID, and each time the user submitted the answer, we'd put the next question inside this paragraph. But we just got a very simple question here, so only a single question thing. And then we have here, I don't know if you can see this very well, but we have if you look at the slides on the course website, you'll be able to see this code clearly. Here we have the paragraph with an input, which is like the response to the response. When the user clicks the submit answer, it will call submit answer here. And here we have the correct answer, and it will get the answer. What it does is it pulls out the text from here using document get element by ID response.value. It checks to see if it equals the correct answer. If it's correct, then we've got a feedback paragraph. Where's the feedback paragraph? Feedback. Yeah, here we go. So here we have a paragraph. The feedback paragraph, it will access this HTML element here, and it will insert into this paragraph answer correct if we got the answer correct. On the other hand, if we got the answer wrong, it will insert into this paragraph in answer incorrect. Okay, that's this paragraph. That's this paragraph here. Okay, so I hope that's clear. So we've got the question. We've got the input field where we submit the answer. Then we've got the correct answer, and we get the answer from the user. We compare it to the correct answer. If it's correct, we modify the document object model so that it contains answer correct. If the user's got it wrong, we insert answer incorrect. So this is great if you want to do a very simple quiz as your game. It's also great as a way of showing you about how you can give feedback to the user if they enter their incorrect login details, for example, which is kind of what we're covering here. So what we're talking about now is form validation. And the idea of form validation is to make sure that the user's entered the correct details. Because if the user enters a bunch of junk and sends it to the server, then that's not going to be very helpful for you to process their request, and you're just going to end up with a database full of rubbish. Or worst case, you're going to send them a bunch of stuff. If you don't check the form carefully, maybe you won't be able to take the payment from the user. Maybe you'll send it to the wrong address Maybe you won't be able to send the email confirmation to the user and so on and so forth. It's very important that you do correct form validation. And it's also extremely important because the user can hack your database by putting like SQL statements or NoSQL statements inside the forms. So if you don't check the forms carefully, you can end up with your whole database being hacked, as we'll cover in a later lecture. So if you don't check that the user's data does not contain SQL statements, they can execute arbitrary commands on your database. And so there's marks for form validation in coursework 1. HTML5 has some form validation built in, but you should also use JavaScript to check that the user input's present and correct before sending it to the server. And also, JavaScript and HTML5 are not enough when it comes to form validation. You also need server-side form validation, as I'll explain next time, because attackers can easily just submit the form independently of your actual web page. So server should always check that the input data is correct. And in the coursework, you can certainly do some form validation with HTML5, but I'm expecting to see some JavaScript form validation as well. So HTML5 form validation is very easy. You just have an input field, type text, and you just add this required attribute without any value on that attribute. And that will make sure that it'll do, in a simple text field, it'll just check that you've entered some text. That's all the required attribute will do there. But again, that's why JavaScript's useful, because you can check more, you can look inside the text and do more thorough form validation. The trouble with the required attribute is it only works on inputs with form tags. So if you have these inputs in a paragraph, as I described in the quiz example, the validation is not going to work because required only operates when the HTML5 elements are inside a form tag. Also might not work on older browsers. HTML5 form validation is also useful because they kind of checks that the users have entered data in the right format. So you often want to check that they've entered a valid email address, or that URL is valid, or a date's valid, and so on and so forth. So I mentioned all these different input types, and what they're really good for is constraining the input from the user, so you're a bit more confident that it's likely to be valid. So if you've got an email input, it's going to check that the email is in a valid format. If it's a telephone, it's going to make sure it's a valid telephone number. This looks a little bit American, or a number, it's going to make sure it doesn't have any letters in it. Color the same. Date the same. It's going to give you a consistent data from the user in a constrained way, and that's extremely useful. So if you look at the email address, for example, if we specify that the email is required and they enter just dog without an @ in the email address, then it'll tell the user that, and then the user can fix it. With a form, you can also specify the JavaScript code that's executed before the inputs, before the form is sent to the server, and the form will not be sent if the JavaScript code returns false. So in this case, we can say on submit equals return validate form, and we have a validate form function here, which checks whatever it needs to check inside the form. If it returns false, the form will not be sent to the server. So this is a way in which you can use the JavaScript to give some feedback or highlight the parts of the form that have missing data and so on and so forth. So if you want to find out more about forms, again, as usual, I like these head first guides. So there's an HTML and CSS book. Chapter 14 goes into the form stuff in quite a bit of detail, and I've taken some of the screenshots out of there. So this lecture, I've explained how you can create and how you can process forms, which will be helpful for your coursework 1, and you're going to use it a whole ton in coursework 2 and probably coursework 3 as well. Next lecture, I'm going to introduce you to HTML local storage.